Morning, everybody. So, confirmation seminar by Melissa Buss. And Melissa, before she came here to start a PhD, worked for Conservation International in Hawaii for 5 years. She was program manager of two different programs to do with marine conservation and also sustainable finance for marine conservation. Her idea in coming here to do a PhD was to take off an NGO advocacy hat to do with sustainable finance in marine conservation and put on a research hat and to analyse what's available in terms of mechanisms, what the feasibilities are in different situations, and to critically examine all that. She's also working part-time for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and one of the things she's doing there is working on an offsets policy. She'll be speaking about offsets this morning in a research capacity, not in a Great Barrier Reef Marine Park officer capacity. As you can see on the screen, Natalie Stoke is co-supervisor, so this is another opportunity for us to collaborate across the campus. Melissa, thank you.
Thanks for getting up early and coming out today. So I'm just going to start by elaborating on the background that Bob said. So it was a decade ago that I finished my master's confirmation seminar. I did a master's in coral reef biogeochemistry and looked at physical and chemical interactions of nutrient uptake. And from that, I started getting into marine conservation with this idea that we needed better science to inform management. And I worked on that for a few years, and I realized that yes, we needed better science, that a lot of people were working in that field, and we had some of the answers. And on my journey, I started working towards realizing that we needed to include stakeholders in the process. So I spent many years developing conservation programs that were participatory and getting fishermen and business people coming together to make decisions about conservation. And through that, I realized that yes, having stakeholders engaged in conservation was one of the key elements. But then I came to a place where I realized we could have stakeholder participation, and there's still something limiting our ability to move forward, and that's about finance and economics. So in my role at CI, I started looking at sustainable funding and innovative finance mechanisms for conservation, and was fortunate enough to be able to raise $10 million for the Hawaii Marine Program. And that was a big success at the time. But as we started implementing the program, I realized even $10 million was a drop in the bucket, and it was nowhere near what we needed to achieve the outcomes. So I decided that I really wanted to focus on this issue and come back and do it in an academic, rigorous sort of way. To my knowledge, nobody has addressed marine conservation finance in an academic fashion, so that has been my challenge and joy over the last year. And I'm going to start by giving some context. In our backyard here, the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. Looking around the room, all of you are quite aware of the biodiversity, cultural heritage, and economic values of the World Heritage Area. Reef-dependent industries alone are bringing in $5 billion a year, and that is just a small portion of the total economic value of our reef. You're also familiar with the threats from multiple use, from fishing and tourism recreation, and particularly from development, from coal imports and shipping along the coast, to the point where UNESCO is threatening to put the World Heritage Area on the endangered list if we don't remedy how the reef is managed. But what you may not know is that Gibraltar currently has a budget of about $50 million. So let me put this into perspective. This is a huge amount of money relative to some places in the world trying to manage marine resources. It's orders of magnitude greater. However, it's very small compared to the investment by large banks into coal and gas. So in the last 4 years, $3.8 billion has been invested from the big four banks in Australia into coal and gas in the Great Barrier Reef region. So what that means is as we struggle to manage marine resources in the water, we're fighting an uphill battle against large investments on land. Last Friday, I published a piece in the Conversation about how we can redirect some of that investment towards reef-friendly businesses, and something I called impact investing. And I'm going to talk more at length about this in my presentation. So this example illustrates the point about environmental externalities. An externality is an effective business that's not accounted for. Globally, the cost to the environment from business is $7.3 trillion, which equates to 13% of global economic output. It's a lot of money that's not accounted for in business. And how this manifests is in a couple ways. Business is trying to maximize profit. We gave the example of coal and steam gas in the Great Barrier Reef. Another example is in Waikiki in Hawaii. So this used to be a wetland area, a nursery area for fish. It is now a world-class tourism destination, and tourism is the basis of the economy there. So there's strong economic incentives to develop this area. At the same time, offshore, we've got a very important fringing reef that is subject to a fishery management area. Now, this area has rotational closure, so it has seasonal open and closed periods. And as Ivor Williams showed, during periods that the FMA is closed, biomass grows. But what we see is this trend over time, which the investigators contribute to the degradation of the habitat due to development. So this is one simple example to show that we may have a well-funded conservation marine protected area in the sea, but if we're not paying attention to what's happening adjacent on land and the investment pressures there, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle. Another way this manifests is through disincentives, such as fisheries subsidies. And I'm going to show this through a little graphic. So if you imagine this school of fish here is the amount of money invested in the world into fishing, the amount of money spent fishing. WWF estimates that up to 25% of that capital comes from governments, subsidies that governments pay people to fish. And the World Bank estimates that only 5% of those subsidies have any sort of environmental benefit. So again, large economic incentives that are going counter to conservation efforts to achieve sustainable fishing. Theoretically, you can incorporate these environmental factors into business. You can reduce environmental externalities through different ways of accounting. And if you do that, you can also theoretically align profit motives with ecological and socio-cultural outcomes. Now, there's ways to design businesses that are supportive of reef health, not diminishing reef health. And I'm going to, again, focus on that later in the presentation. If that is done, theoretically, you'll decrease the need for conservation funding. You'll create a self-sustaining system where reef health is perpetuated by businesses making money and also protecting the environment. But in the meantime, a significant conservation funding gap exists that needs to be addressed. So I'm going to characterize this funding gap with three characteristics. First is about size. Now, nobody knows what the size of the gap is. Experts agree that there's chronic underfunding in marine conservation worldwide, but we simply do not have the numbers to tell the story. The only numbers we have are, there's 2 studies that have been done to estimate reaching marine protected area targets, and both studies converged on this figure of $4.8 billion per year underfunded if we want to achieve MPA targets. Now, bear in mind that we have reason to believe that that's an underestimate. And also, achieving 10%, 20% coverage of MPAs does not necessarily mean we've achieved all of our ecological or sociocultural outcomes. So this is a gross underestimate of the true size of the funding gap. Another way to characterize the gap is looking at duration. So typically, marine conservation is funded from philanthropic or government grants, often on the order of 1 to 3 years. And the time that it takes to achieve outcomes in the water, as you guys in this room know, can take up to decades. So there's this mismatch in temporal scale. And what happens is that we have conservation programs that have to constantly be looking for new sources of revenue. They have to rebrand themselves every few years to be the new shiny object to get money. And that's harmful to the implementation of conservation. It also leads to a system where donors don't know if their investments are leading to outcomes. They know how many reports are produced, but they may need different donors at the start of a project and then to the time to get outcomes. So it's not a good system for measuring effectiveness. The third characteristic is about diversity. So modern portfolio theory teaches us that to reduce risk, we have to diversify sources of revenue. And that's kind of an intuitive thing, right? And we've seen this manifest in marine conservation when a program is overly reliant on government dollars and then political change, or a philanthropist decides he wants to invest in health instead of marine, and all of a sudden you have a conservation program half implemented with stakeholders on the ground and no way to finish. So we've seen this happen over and over again, and this is part of the gap that needs to be addressed. Part of the reason for this gap is the economic incentives and profit motives that I've spoken about, but part of it also has to do with planning. So right now, the way the conservation plan comes into being, it used to be that we just focused on the ecological aspects and did some ecological planning, and over time started adding some economic analyses and social and cultural analyses. Over time, stakeholders began to be involved, and all of you understand the importance of including stakeholders and how that can increase the effectiveness of a conservation program. And we end up with a conservation plan. Now, about a year ago, I did a scoping survey and asked marine conservation professionals who are implementing plans, do you have a fundraising strategy or a business plan for your conservation strategy? 50% said no. Why? Why do we have all these conservation plans and half of them are unfunded? I believe part of the answer has to do with this. After the plan is written, somebody says, hey, we need money. They send it over to the development department, and then they opportunistically raise money and make finance decisions. It's a very linear process, happens after the fact, and stakeholders are not engaged. We end up with programs where finance decisions can impact on community values, and there's no way to feed back into that loop. So I'm proposing that we need to address it by integrating finance into decision-making from the beginning. Stakeholders must be involved in finance decisions, and finance decisions can create opportunities for different ways to attack a conservation problem, so it needs to be part of an iterative loop. Now, those of you with your experience in the room might understand how hard it was to integrate social and cultural values into conservation decision-making. So you can see, by extension, the difficulty it's going to be in bringing this finance world into the fold. But I believe it has to be done if we want effective conservation. What I've talked to you about so far are some highlights from my literature review. And I wanted to just show you momentarily. As I said in the beginning, no one has really done marine conservation finance research in an academic capacity. So this required bringing together the fields of finance, ecological economics, sustainable development, natural resource management, social science, and marine ecology. Finding data, methods, theories, little bits of the puzzle from all different places and synthesizing them together to form this research. So to summarize the results of the literature review before moving on, the first question I asked, is finance limiting the success of marine conservation? Yes, it's one of several limits. Now there are other limits, including governance issues, enforcement, stakeholder involvement. It's not the only limit. I would never say that we just need money and we'll solve all our problems. But it is one very important limit, and if we don't address it, it has the ability to limit implementation, regardless of other issues. What are the drivers and characteristics of the gap? Well, as it talks about, the drivers are economic incentives, misplaced liability, and lack of integration of finance into conservation planning. And also the characteristics are about revenue size, duration, and diversity. The third question I asked, what are the potential solutions to minimize the gap? Impact investments, innovative finance mechanisms, methods for participatory analysis of both finance mechanisms and impact investments, and a critical examination of each mechanism in detail. So impact investments I'm going to focus on in Chapter 2. Finance mechanisms and the methods for selecting a mechanism per site is Chapter 3. And critical examination of a mechanism in detail will be Chapter 4. And that can be illustrated better by this diagram. And I'm going to be referring to this throughout the rest of the presentation today. So I've talked about the literature review. Chapter 2 is impact investing, and I'm going to focus on that next. You may have heard many of these terms, and when I was driving in today, I was listening to an interview with Bill Gates on the radio. He's famous for coining the term creative capitalism. All of these terms are quite similar, socially responsible investing, but I want to define for you clearly what I mean by impact investing in relation to all these commonly used terms. Impact investing is, simply put, achieving environmental and community outcomes while also generating financial return. Now, it's an evolution of some other concepts. So triple bottom line return usually refers to ecological, socio-cultural, and economic returns. So it's quite similar to impact investing. Also from the economics literature, we can talk about utility maximizing more than just profit, but other outcomes of business. But the difference in compared to old school sustainable development and socially responsible investing is some of those initiatives aimed to just not invest in the bad stuff. Let's not put money in that company because they use child labor. Whereas impact investing says, let's proactively go out and solve challenging environmental issues, but let's recycle our capital on the side so we can keep our program going. Now, the industry is worth $9 billion globally right now. This is 2013 figures, but it's expected to grow to $500 billion by 2019. So this is a huge industry. It's growing rapidly. There are people from all walks of life and all industries getting engaged. However, it's relatively untested in the marine conservation context, and that's why I think it's really valuable that we take this and see if it can work in the marine conservation world. There are some early pioneers who have used impact investing to solve marine problems. Sea Change Fund provides debt or equity to sustainable seafood companies in the middle of the seafood chain, distributors, marketers. These companies have to meet rigorous criteria in order to get access to a loan. If they do that, they have access to the capital. It's usually subsidized capital, so it's cheaper. And then they pay it back, and that money is available then for the next cohort of businesses. Similar, business competition in the US, Fish 2.0 gives out loans to sustainable seafood companies. Now, this is new this year, and hundreds of applications are out there. Strategies for how to make money and increase the sustainability of fisheries. You guys should go check out their website. It's really innovative stuff. Another example would be like Misol Resort in Russia Ampat. This is a for-profit eco-lodge in marine protected area. They're achieving community outcomes and shark conservation while also generating financial return. But there's many more. These are 3 examples, but there's many more out there that we need to test. I'm going to be testing impact investing. I have 4 questions, and I'm going to be doing this through a series of surveys. So I'm going to break this down for you. The first set of surveys is going to be with marine experts. Global survey. These are going to be experts that do marine conservation, who have done impact investing in other fields, who have done similar sort of innovative finance work. And the questions that I'm going to be asking: which projects or businesses could generate triple bottom line returns? Now, not every aspect of marine conservation can make money, and it shouldn't. Stakeholder engagement, for example, policy development, will never generate a return. Most businesses cannot have measurable impacts in the marine environment, but there's a subset of both of those, and we need to identify them. Right now, it's just theory. Hey, we think we can achieve triple bottom line returns. We need to find out specifically what are the projects or businesses that could achieve these returns, and how and by whom should the ecological and socio-cultural returns be measured. Now, this may seem like a simple idea. We know how to measure change in the marine environment. But what we do not know how to do is to break apart a complex system where there's lots of investments, lots of impacts. How do we tie together one investment with one set of ecological returns? So it's very complicated to break that down and figure out how do we measure that and who should be measuring that. I'm going to be doing these surveys through a method called a decision Delphi. Now, I've picked the decision Delphi because it's a way to iteratively do expert elicitation. And the advantages of it, you can build consensus while minimizing the negative effects of group dynamics. So when I'm bringing together people from around the world, who come from different cultural backgrounds and different levels of expertise, there can often be some bias in the group, outspoken people, quiet people, and trying to bring together these different layers of expertise. The decision Delphi helps to achieve that. So there will be 60 experts that are targeted. That's based on, I've identified 70 organizations that could have some expertise to offer. And each of those organizations might have 2 or 3 individuals working in a related field. So I'm hoping to get an N of 60. The survey will be done online. It will be emailed out. And participants will do the survey first, answer these questions, and then there will be a period of moderated feedback. So with the decision Delphi, you look at the results, you give the feedback back to the experts, and then you ask them to fill out the survey again a second time, and then they have the chance to change their answers based on their colleagues' responses. And it's a way to build consensus. The data will be collected both quantitatively and qualitatively. So there will be Likert type questions, but also qualitative. Why? Why do you think this would work? What are the nuances and the social and cultural outcomes that you expect or challenges that you anticipate? In the middle of these two rounds, there will be an investor survey. So this one I'm really excited about because what we know is that there are trade-offs. You might have a situation where you can generate a lot of profit, maybe a little bit of an environmental impact. Or, on the other hand, make a big environmental impact and a little bit of profit. And investor behavior is often up to their perceptions and the biases that they bring to it. So we need to find out what combination of rates of return would be acceptable. How much profit do you need to make if I save 5 fish versus an entire marine protected area? We need to quantify this. And the second question is, which mechanisms would be preferred? So, for example, bonds versus loan funds. What mechanism would investors be more likely to invest in and why? I'm going to target bank, private, and foundation investors using professional networks to recruit. And it will be an online 2-part survey. Ideally, this survey will also be repeated. However, there's a chance that investors will be less willing to cooperate and do a second round, but I'm going to make an attempt at that. And again, both quantitative data. So quantitative, I'm playing with looking at choice modeling, might be one way to address this, but also qualitative. So what are your perceptions and biases and feelings about this? Because that type of information helps us to determine how to market to investors. So those surveys will come together to define impact ocean finance mechanisms. And the outputs will be a definition of trade-offs that are acceptable to investors. So we have quantitative and qualitative information. Also, which mechanism will be preferred? I hope to produce advantages and disadvantages of some top-ranked mechanisms and descriptions of the context in which you might use one mechanism versus another. Also, I'm hoping to produce an inventory of projects and businesses with predicted rates of return. So these are examples of how you could generate triple bottom line returns. And ideally, we'd have some quantitative information about rates of return, but also lots of qualitative. Well, we think this will help the community, but more work needs to be done to quantify how. And also, lastly, we'll produce an analysis of options and recommendations for how and by whom should ecological and socio-cultural returns be measured. So that's chapter 2, and that will also feed in to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is looking at innovative finance mechanisms, of which the for-profit stuff is just one sector. I'm going to be looking at 3 sectors and 3 sites. So this diagram shows some innovative finance mechanisms. Now there's hundreds of finance mechanisms out there, and I've pulled together a simple diagram to show some of the mechanisms that are found from the finance literature, from the marine conservation gray literature, and tried to pull them together in some sort of categorization. And the colored boxes are specific examples, such as this one, which is referring to the example of the Liesel Eco Resort, which I mentioned earlier. You can broadly classify finance mechanisms as economic incentives. Revenue generation tools are those that do both, such as a fee. So this was an attempt at looking at, from the literature, what are the different options out there to raise revenue. Now I'm hypothesizing that we need to do this analysis by the sectors. And there's a couple reasons for this. Some mechanisms would only work for one sector. So government can raise a tax if they want, nonprofit can't. So there's a simple distinguishment between some things can only be done by each sector. But it's not that simple when you dig deeper. So a government has the power to raise a tax, but often they require a nonprofit advocating for policy. The tax is levied, and then the nonprofit benefits by grants. So this is a nuanced relationship between the sectors, which needs further investigation. I'm also hypothesizing that finance mechanism feasibility will differ across sites. So I've picked 3 sites, Great Barrier Reef, Fiji, and Hawaiian Islands. And I've picked them because of the differences. So Great Barrier Reef has a strong federal government. Looking to my federal government colleagues in the room. A large gross regional product. And I've compared that with Hawaii, which has a stronger state government, a little bit of community stewardship, and then Fiji has more community co-management. So there's differences across marine resource governance, differences across social and economic vulnerability. Great Barrier Reef and Hawaii have low vulnerability to reef degradation, whereas Fiji has very high. But I've also looked at factors such as World Giving Index. This is how charitable a nation is. Interestingly, Australia and New Zealand rank #1 in the world, most charitable. USA ranks 5, and Fiji's not even ranked. However, Fiji gets a lot of philanthropy from their NGO partners, and they have access to multilateral donations. So my hypothesis is that with these 3 sites, we're going to see a variety of mechanisms that rank as the most feasible. To do this, I'm going to walk you through this. At each site, I'm going to be doing first a site visit to do some scoping, to identify the key stakeholders, make sure I have all the financial records that are necessary. And from that, I'll move on to a desktop screening. So this is just to say some mechanisms will clearly not work in some areas. So the example would be a hotel tax would not work in a place where there's no hotels. So this is a simple level of screening that I'm going to do by myself to say which mechanisms could possibly work at each of these 3 sites for each of these 3 sectors. From that, we'll do a workshop to do a multi-criteria participatory analysis. Now, multi-criteria is referring to the ecological, socio-cultural, economic, and financial aspects of it. So this can be seen as it's similar to the utility maximizing function, where we're trying to see how do we maximize all of these criteria and not just looking at financial returns. The workshop will be 2-part. The first day we'll talk about risks, costs, benefits, and opportunities for the mechanisms. And I should pull up that these are the list of the types of stakeholders that will be engaged at each site. So as you can see, pulling together fishermen with marine tour operators, with NGOs, bringing together the spectrum, because this is how participatory conservation planning is done in other spheres, and we need to bring finance up to par. The second part of the workshop will be scoring each of those criteria and letting the stakeholders do a weighting process. Now, I'm hypothesizing that social and cultural criteria may be given a higher weight in a place like Fiji, whereas financial returns may be giving a higher weight in a place like the Great Barrier Reef. But who knows? They might be the same across all the sites, and that would be a really interesting finding as well. At the end of this process, we'll have a list of ranked mechanisms per site. So I haven't had time to go into this, but one of my questions is about revenue diversification. So I'm going to be calculating indices for each place and talking about how diversification varies and why. The second question is about what criteria should be used. I have a list of criteria from the literature review that I've adapted to be used in a participatory process. And how would stakeholders weight the criteria? So again, hoping to see across these sites, are the weightings the same or different, and why? And then what are the advantages and disadvantages of finance mechanisms at each site? So across sector and across sites, what are the highest ranked, most feasible mechanisms, and why? And can we see patterns? Can we, for example, say another place with a similar context to Fiji would find the same mechanisms feasible? Or do we find from this that it's so different across sites that we then have to do this sort of participatory analysis every time we need a finance strategy? It'll be interesting to find out. That's chapter 3. Now, for my final chapter, I'm going to zoom in on this little square here and look at one mechanism for government funding in the GBR, and that is biodiversity offsets. Now, it's one thing to say a set of mechanisms are feasible in an area. It's another thing completely to zoom in on the level of detail and say, yes, but will it really work, and how do you make it work? So that's what I'm going to be doing in this last chapter. Simply put, offsets are activities to compensate for impacts. Now, offsets are part of a process of environmental impact assessment for proposed development, and they are supposed to be last in the mitigation hierarchy of avoiding impacts, mitigating impacts, either restoring or minimizing, mitigating, offsetting, and additional conservation action. So ideally, you would get to a safe situation where you had a predicted impact from a development, and through this hierarchy and through the implementation of offsets, you end up in a place of net positive impacts, ideally. 29 countries have offset policies. 14 of these, including Australia, allow fiscal transfers. So what that means is the proponent doesn't necessarily have to do the work themselves. They can give money, either to the government or to a third party, to do the offset for them. That's why this is a sustainable finance mechanism. It can lead to substantial amounts of money. I set up a mitigation policy in Micronesia that was worth $50 million to local nonprofits there. $50 million is a huge amount of money to tiny little nonprofits in the middle of the ocean. So it can be a good source of revenue. But there's lots of things we need to critically look at. Here in the Great Barrier Reef, last year, SOPAC put out a new biodiversity offset policy defining net conservation benefits. So it's a relatively new policy, relatively untested, and particularly we have not tested it very well in the marine environment. Now the policy does call for net conservation benefits. However, there's a little clause in there that says, due to scientific uncertainty, you can make exceptions for marine offsets. So what that does is it leaves it wide open to proponents to say how they want to interpret that. Oh, there's a little uncertainty in this bay, so we're not going to do an offset according to international guidelines. So we really need to look at how this policy should be implemented in the marine environment. Currently, there are 5 approvals given by SOPAC under this policy. So that's Chute Harbor, Great Couple Island, and 3 liquefied natural gas developments on Curtis Island. And they are likely to bring in about $2 to $4 million per year to the Rumpa. However, I should stress no money has changed hands yet. This is according to approval conditions, but the money has not been given. And there's also 2 other, Abbott Point, there's a public environment report, and in Port of Townsville, environmental impact statement, which are out and have been out recently for public review that contain proposals for marine offsets. The wide variety of what these proponents have said qualifies as a marine offset is quite alarming. So to just give you a few examples, so Abbott Point is saying no residual impact, biggest coal port in the world, no residual impact. But to be nice, we're going to offset by doing a water quality improvement plan. Port of Townsville is saying, well, yes, we're going to do fish restoration areas, but also we're going to rescind an objection to the enhancement of a fishery habitat area, and that qualifies as an offset if we just stop, stopping government process. How can that be considered to get net conservation gains? So we need to really critically look at these and say, is this how we want to do marine offsets in the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area? So I'm going to be asking, what are the critical process steps for effective implementation? And I've got a draft here. Now, I've talked about the mitigation hierarchy. I really think we need to look bigger than that. This is beyond just how do we do environmental impact assessment. We need to start by looking at how to plan for sustainable development and end with how do we monitor offsets, evaluate their efficacy, and feed back up. So this is a first draft of what this conceptual diagram might look like. And the next steps for me are to look at which of these steps are more important than others and how would this go about being implemented in the real world. Second, what are the advantages and disadvantages with the different roles that Gabropa could play? Now, interestingly, there are lots of, there's an international group, the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, and they've outlined different roles that government could play in relation to offsets. And then I have said, well, what would that look like in our context here? There are lots of roles that Gabropa could play that they're not currently playing. And we really need to look at this closely because there's huge consequences depending on what role the government takes. Gabropa could be a policymaker. Currently there is no policy for offsets for Gabropa. Gabropa could sell offsets, but right now we don't have any offsets to sell. But there's critical questions to be asked. The role that has been slated by SOPAC right now is for Gabropa to receive monies. But there's questions about financial liability. If the money is received and we don't achieve net conservation benefits, who's liable for that? There's questions about regulatory capture. Is the public going to perceive this as paying to pollute? We've already seen lots of media to suggest that this is a concern out there. So we need to assess each of these roles and find out what are the advantages and disadvantages of each and how can government be best placed to implement effective offsets. My third question has to do with what principles and processes should be implemented to increase effectiveness. So there needs to be a definition of net conservation gains relative to the marine environment. Right now, we really don't have any good definition for that. We need to define additionality. Offsets are supposed to be in addition to current management, to other things that proponents have to do, like monitoring, but this is not well scoped out. We need a process for evaluating and doing a risk assessment of proposed offsets. I'm already working on adapting an international risk assessment to be used in our context. We need a decision tree. There's different types of offsets. You can do direct, which is like seagrass impact, seagrass restoration. Or you can do indirect, which would be seagrass impact and turtle restoration. So they're connected but not direct, and we have to be able to define when should you pick direct and when should you pick indirect. So a decision tree for that. How to calculate financial liability. Right now, we have no good method for saying how much a proponent should pay. It's based kind of on just precedent of what they did last year, which was based on who knows what. Should it be based on the ecosystem service value that was lost? Should it be based on the cost of managing and implementing the offset, or some combination of both? This needs to be sussed out, and we need to have a strong method for saying this is how much an offset needs to be worth. And of course, back to the monitoring and evaluation. So most of the literature says that we don't know if offsets work because no one's monitoring them, no one's collecting data. How can we ever say if an offset's working if we don't check on its progress? At the end of this thesis, what I'm hoping to have through chapter 2 is the big picture look. How do we close the conservation funding gap by aligning economic incentives with our conservation outcomes? And then, in the meantime, how do we generate enough revenue that's big enough in size, long enough in duration, and diverse enough to be stable to fund conservation outcomes while we are doing this bigger picture work? And also to have an in-depth zoom-in look on, once we have a set of finance mechanisms, how do we implement them effectively? I'd like to thank Bob and Natalie for your support for this research over the last year, and also the National Environmental Research Program, which has funded me through a scholarship. Thank you. Any questions?
I had a question about your chapter 3.
Yes.
I was interested in your cases. One of your cases is Fiji. Is that all of Fiji? Fiji as a country?
I think it's yet to be determined, but most likely a smaller subset of Fiji. So I've already identified that there's some alternative livelihood programs and some things that could be seen as for-profit marine conservation. So we might zoom in on a couple of those areas. Fiji as a country is likely too big for this work, but I'm still scoping that out.
Because the diversity in Fiji of where you might, one thing might work and one thing won't, it's massive.
Certainly.
And then you had your 3 kind of stakeholder groups, and for Fiji, one important one is resource users and who also own the resources.
Yes.
So they're not captured by government, not profit or for profit. So there's quite a lot of complexity within there. So I think what you select, like which sites you select as well, really affect like what kind of answers you come up with in terms of what's effective and what works and what can't work.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good point. And one of the ways I've thought about addressing this is saying instead of government calling that the resource manager, which would then, in Fiji's case, be communities. So that's one way of looking at it. But you're right, there's a lot of complexity there, and we'd have to, but the same thing could be said about GBR and Hawaii. There's lots of variety within those places as well. So I'm looking more at a macro scale and comparing across, yes, there's diversity within Fiji, but there's also diversity between Fiji and Hawaii and GBR, so I'm kind of trying to stay at that scale.
Melissa, you mentioned early on that this, I think you said you thought this was the first study of marine conservation finance. And I was just wondering, is there a world of terrestrial conservation finance out there? And I'm just thinking about what the actual distinctions are. Are you looking at that broader area of conservation finance as applied to marine systems, or is there something about marine systems that's going to need to do it completely differently? In which case, what is that?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. So we often say, I think in the marine world, we have to learn a lot from terrestrial conservation. So there's more peer-reviewed literature in terrestrial conservation finance, but it's still quite limited. Most of this is being done in a nonprofit peer-reviewed space. The distinction that I make, often in terrestrial conservation, the finance mechanisms have to do with ownership of the land, ownership of the resource. And that really does not always apply in the marine environment. There's sometimes where you can buy a seabed, but usually we're talking about a common pool resource, and the finance mechanisms have to reflect that, the stakeholder engagement has to reflect that. So while there's similarities and there's lessons we can learn, I think the analysis has to be done separately because of the commonality of the resources.
I agree with the sentiment of both the questions before, and I guess mine lead on from that. I'm a bit skeptical about your statement that this is the first marine focus in this arena. What about the natural capitals group in Stanford? Don't they have a big team in Belize?
When I made that statement, I was saying in the academic context, in the peer-reviewed literature, there are very few studies. Yes, there are some exceptions, and yes, I'm in contact with the natural capital group. But in terms of looking at feasibility of mechanisms across contexts, I don't believe that's been done within a context, within Belize. They've identified a few mechanisms which they're looking at in detail, but this broader picture of how do we go to a site and figure out which of the many mechanisms out there would be most feasible given the stakeholders and the context there. To my knowledge, that hasn't been done. If it is, I'd love to know about it.
Aren't there some Jeff groups, World Bank groups, working on these issues? There's a blue carbon group that's just
There is a blue carbon group, yes.
So presumably there are academics driving that?
So go back up to, I'm just going to refer to this. There are, as you say, there's the blue carbon group. As you say, there are studies focused on, so there are, say, for example, 3 publications on private marine protected areas that I'm aware of. There are a couple publications, or there's lots of publications on fisheries catch shares. Bringing it all together in this sort of way and analyzing across the mechanisms, that's what I'm hoping to contribute.
So when you say marine conservation projects,
Marine conservation finance.
Of projects.
Of projects.
You use that phrase, I wrote it down, marine conservation project. I then put a question mark after it. What's your definition of a marine conservation project? Is it restricted to MPAs and fisheries?
No.
So would financing for carbon emissions fall under the gamut of a marine conservation project?
I'm determining that the scope is going to be blue carbon, yes, other carbon, no, because I have to limit it some way to make this a doable thesis. So I would consider blue carbon and mangrove restoration, yes. Other sorts of carbon trading schemes would be outside of the scope.
Okay. And going back to Pip's question, you had a table there which had one of Halpern's marine health indices.
The Ocean Health Index, yeah.
I don't think they're worth the paper they're written on, to be honest with you. So what does 67 mean? Does it apply to the entire Great Barrier Reef?
So I agree with you. I think
what you're saying is a dredge spoil site inside the marine park has the same score as the outer barrier north of Cooktown. Doesn't make a lot of sense.
I agree with you. There's lots of valid criticism of the Ocean Health Index. However, I was trying to come up with indices that I could compare across sites, and this is one of the few that are out there. I think that yes, there's variation within each of these sites, but these I was trying to get an index that could look at that scale. And if you know a better one, I'd be happy to use it.
Well, what use is it? If Pip's right, then the 53 for Fiji probably ranges from 0 to 100.
So this is just the intent of this is not to use these numbers in any sort of calculation, but it's to give a qualitative description more than anything about the varying contexts.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But I've been very wary of what that number actually means.
Sure.
If Fiji is large, the Great Barrier Reef is huge. So how do you deal with that in terms of Chapter 3? The sort of people you would talk to in Cooktown would projects will be completely different. You've got to integrate on that.
Certainly. I think that's part of the scoping, which is the first step. I've already identified the preliminary list of stakeholders I'd like to talk to, but I foresee that the first step would be going to that initial list and saying, do we address, at what scale do we want to address this? I am leaning towards trying to get a GBR look, again, because I'm trying to compare at the scale of GBR compared to Hawaii. I do think that there are some broad differences. So another one I did, the World Giving Index. So Great Barrier Reef, regardless, so charitable index includes both philanthropy and volunteer time. Now, I think most of us know that philanthropy in Australia is typically much lower than philanthropy in Hawaii or in Fiji through outside partners. So at that scale of distinction, there's a big difference when we're looking for money. In Hawaii, we're going to go straight to the wealthy donors. In Australia, probably not. Probably here, we're going to have to look at more market-based systems. So at that scale, there are distinguishing features that allow us to see which mechanisms would be more feasible.
Sorry, Terry, I'll just jump in with a question about offsets. That table you had a figure that 4 to 8 million or 2 to 4 million could flow to Gabunpa out of offsets. And then you had a table about one of the things you needed to look at was, I think, regulatory capture.
Yeah.
So, and there are pros and cons in there. For me, and this could be really simplistic, for me, it seems like Gabunpa receiving $2 to $4 million per year as a regulator is just a bad idea in terms of at least the perception of conflict of interest.
Yeah, Bob, I think we need to look at it very closely. I think I really do see some advantages and disadvantages. So clearly the disadvantage is public perception of regulatory capture, whether it's real or not, it's public perception of it, which can undermine the authority's position. But on the other hand, we're working in a marine environment, a reef that's far away from land, where sending proponents out to do in-work restoration is not necessarily the best idea. These proponents know how to develop coal and how to build ports. They do not necessarily know how to do seagrass restoration. They don't know the intricacies of the strategy involved in doing a reef-wide ecosystem-based management. So I think we need to look at it carefully. And one of the answers may be doing a risk assessment and building business systems where it's very clear and transparent to all involved that avoidance, minimization, and mitigation are happening first before offsets are even on the table.
Sorry, would you like to respond to that?
Mine just builds on that comment. I guess my feedback for Chapter 4 would be not to look solely at biodiversity offsets, but rather look at the ecosystem as a whole,
Yep.
Particularly if you're referring to the Great Barrier Reef. Obviously, the work that Gabunpa does extends beyond regulation. It focuses very heavy with stakeholder engagement, so really making sure to pick up the ecosystem services, including social and cultural values, would be important to reflect the World Heritage values.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And I'm not on here for time, but I think the key question is how do we offset impacts to heritage? John's going to answer that for us.
Yeah, I agree with you about the conflict of interest issue. It's broader than just Gabunpa. In the case of Gabunpa, I think there are issues beyond just public perception, because I think it's inappropriate that a regulator should be paid for basically bad practice by ports. There's also a conflict of interest with the scientific community because the so-called mitigation, the restoration projects will generate a new industry, and some science providers I think are already lining up to cash into that. So I think that could be an important issue for you to examine. In that context, my opinion of marine restoration projects is that they're mostly fraudulent because they fail. The mitigation issue, though, is broader than just the marine environment. If I'm reading the Queensland reports correctly, a port authority could in fact pay for a hospital for sick koala bears or plant gum trees, and that would still be an offset for dumping dredge spoil within the even worse than it sounds on the paper. I've a question now. That was a comment. You talked about the need to involve stakeholders, but I think it came across as a little bit token, and this goes back to Pip's comment. So the two stakeholders you seem to dwell on were wealthy donors in Hawaii. You name them as a group, and marine experts. You didn't really talk about subsistence fishers or people who aren't wealthy or influential in other places. So my question is, if 50% of your marine experts don't have the common sense to have a business plan as part of their operations, are they really experts? And how are you going to pick these people for your expert elicitation?
Thanks, Terry. So,
would it be more neutral to call them, I don't know, marine conservation practitioners, a few of which might be expert?
possibly yes, but I would define expert more broadly than that. I think that there's expertise there, and that we need to draw that out. So I don't think it's a reflection on the professionalism or the ability of these people. I think the system is broken. The system is designed this way, and also I think people haven't really thought that much about it. So we're trained, and one way I was trained in chemistry and came to this. Lots of people have training in very natural science fields. They rise to a place where they're writing conservation strategies and they don't know a thing about finance. So I think it's just that we need to be able to reach across disciplines and show people how it can be done. In terms of stakeholders, I know this is really small font, and I apologize for that, but it's not just wealthy. When I said wealthy donors, I was talking about an investor, not a stakeholder group. So local government, regional and federal government, the list goes on of the stakeholders that need to be engaged in this, and I don't think it's token. In fact, I think it's central to my thesis that finance decisions cannot be made alone in a room with finance professionals. We have to get communities involved, and that's part of what's really driving me to do this work.
I don't think you really understand what I'm on about. I think stakeholder is much broader than just the two groups of people who you seem to be focusing on. And by calling us experts, you're actually, from a social science perspective, putting us on a pedestal. So it's about issues like power and equity, which differentiate different stakeholder groups and give them a certain status.
So Terry, these are also considered experts.
Maybe someone like Pip could comment on that.
Can I clarify first? These are considered experts.
They're the ones that,
This is the list.
going to do that's the cross section.
What I'm objecting to is the term expert.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
And there's a huge literature on equity and influence of different stakeholder groups. And the ones who are poor or lack influence tend not to be even counted as stakeholders. And I think there's a danger that you're going down that path.
So clearly the terminology needs to be worked on, but I actually think we are agreeing. I'm saying that these people have knowledge that's very important that we need to harness, and we can't just rely on finance experts, that these are the people that need to be involved in the decision making. Poor people, recreational fishermen, subsistence fishermen. So I think we're agreeing that those people have knowledge that need to come to bear in these decisions.
Yeah, again, there's a whole literature out there on different types of knowledge.
Yes.
You're talking about scientific and financial knowledge.
No, I'm not. I'm talking about their experience going out trying to feed their family and how that would influence, do we put a fisheries catch share program in? What are the equity considerations? They need to be involved.
Okay, I stand corrected, but I didn't get that impression from the way you presented.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well done. Thank you.
Thank you.